So the responses selection comes up also when we're artificially selecting for a certain trait. And we can do this in animal breeding or plant breeding, or doing artificial selection experiments in a genetics lab. So shown is an example of, say, over 80 generations, corn, I believe, or maybe some other crop, was selected for oil content. And in this case, there was a fairly consistent increase in oil content over many generations of selection, where they're consistently only allowing the top oil content plants to breed. Whereas here down at the bottom, they're selecting for low oil content, and there may be so from experiments like this, we can actually calculate heritability. So that's another way we can calculate heritability, is by looking at the responses selection. And we can do that even just from a single generation. We don't need to do it for 80 generations. But so there is some limits to the responses selection. So often in doing these types of selection experiments, this is not a good example here, but often, and particularly when selecting for either high or low, maybe not necessarily both, you're going to get a leveling off of the response. A selection where after a certain number of generations, you're not going to be able to increase the trait or decrease the trait anymore. And this may be due to a couple of different things. For one thing, you may have through many generations of selection, you may be actually have whittled down genetic variation in that population to essentially zero, where now you no longer have enough genetic variation for selection to act upon. This essentially makes your heritability zero, because if you don't have genetic variance, your heritability is zero. However, you could still be having genetic variance in the population, but you're still not getting a responsive selection. And this may be due to a couple different things. You may end up with opposing selection. So for example, if you are selecting for small body size in mice, you may be running up against some limit where you can't select for it anymore because mice below that level are just not surviving. So you're running up against developmental constraints that are preventing the trait from getting any smaller or bigger. It could work both ways. So there may be selection, a different type of selection acting against that trait to sort of keep it where it is. Okay. We can also see correlated responses to selection, where say you're selecting for one thing, but then a number of other traits also change in response to selection for this one trait. And this is due to, it could be due to a couple different things. It could be due to a phenotypic correlation between the traits, or some association between the traits. So for example, if you're selecting for body size in mice, you're selecting for bigger mice, you may accidentally also select for mice that have larger litter sizes, just because larger mice can produce more offspring. So that's a phenotypic correlation between those traits. Phenotypic correlations can also be caused by environmental correlations, where you have correlated effects of the environment on two different phenotypes. One could be plant size. One could be plant size, and so let's say you have two traits: size and fecundity, meaning how many offspring you produce. That could be due to sort of a physiological effect, or it could be due to environmental effect. So the mouse example would be sort of a physiological effect, whereas in plants, if you have more moisture content, let's say you're both going to get bigger plants as well as more seeds, for example. And so environmental correlations may play a role in that as well. And finally, phenotypic correlations can be caused by genetic correlations, where you have genes that they could be linked. So if you have like physically close together on the same chromosome, such that if you're selecting for one, you're automatically also selecting for the other, just because they're closely situated on the same chromosome. Or you can have a subset of the same genes are controlling both the trait that you're selecting on as well as a different trait. And this is called pleiotropy, where the same gene can control multiple traits. As an example of correlated responses to selection, in Russia, silver foxes were domesticated over the course of about 50 generations, such that they would choose the foxes, and these foxes were originally bred and reared for the fur trade, and the breeders selectively bred foxes that were more docile and more habituated to humans, and through the process of that selection, they actually also bred for traits that made them more dog-like. And so they tended to get floppier ears, they tended to get curly tails, their coat color changed. And so in selecting just for docility, just for certain behavioral traits, they also accidentally selected for a bunch of other physical coat color and tail structure and ear floppiness traits that actually ended up making them look more like domesticated dogs, which was kind of interesting. Okay, so that completes the quantitative genetics lecture, and next time we're going to talk about population genetics.